What is the Bible? Many times I hear people cite it as if it were a single book, arguing that the entire book should be read in a certain way, or that the entire book should share a similar theme. This view, however, is a common misconception. The Bible is not one book, but a collection of books, written over a period of nearly 1,000 years, if not more. The word Bible comes from the Greek biblia, meaning roughly the books. There are two testaments in the Bible, the Old and the New. Broadly speaking, the Old Testament follows the history of the Israelites and the promise of a coming Messiah. The New Testament documents the arrival, life, death, and resurrection of that Messiah, Jesus Christ. In this video, we will be focusing on the New Testament and how it came to be. The New Testament is composed of 27 books in the Catholic tradition, which include the four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, the Pauline epistles, the Catholic epistles, and Revelation, otherwise known as the Apocalypse of John. The corpus of books contained in this testament are what are known as the Canon of Scripture. The word canon simply means a rule or a standard. The Canon of Scripture refers to the books recognized by the Church as inspired. Immediately following the death and resurrection of Christ, there was no New Testament. Christ himself didn't leave any writings, and so he left it to his apostles to bear witness and testify to his work on earth. What happened in a broad sense was that the apostles began their ministry spreading the good news of Christ, and through the next century or so originated the writings of the New Testament individually. The authorship and dating of the works is an unsettled scholarly debate. We don't have access to any original copies of any biblical work. However, based on available evidence, there are theories about the origin of each one. First are the four Gospels. Matthew is traditionally ascribed to Matthew the Apostle around 80 to 90 AD. Mark is ascribed to a companion of Peter bearing the same name, possibly written in 65 to 70 AD in Rome. Luke is ascribed to Luke the physician, a companion of Paul, written around 80 to 90 AD. The author of this gospel is also seen as the same author of Acts of the Apostles. Finally, John is traditionally written by John the Apostle around 90 to 100 AD. However, many scholars posit that the works were actually completed by scribes or other educated Christians in the early apostolic circles. Unfortunately, it seems as if we will never know for sure. Moving on to the Pauline epistles. Many of the epistles are universally acknowledged to come from the Apostle Paul with little disagreement. They come from the period of Paul's ministry, around 40 to 65 AD. There are some that are disputed, however, placing them a few decades later among Paul's followers, but this is speculation. Next come the other letters, commonly called the Catholic epistles, with a lowercase c. In this case, Catholic meaning universal. To begin with Hebrews, it was originally debated to be Pauline, but the modern consensus is that the author is not Paul, but rather unknown to us. The following letters are treated similarly, although the most likely origin was through communities connected to the apostles, if not the apostles themselves. The years of composition range from 60 to 110 AD. Finally comes the Revelation of John, which is traditionally ascribed to John the Apostle while exiled on the island of Patmos, around 90 to 100 AD. We find that these books were generally all composed in a 50-year period or so, and largely come from either the latter half of the apostles' lives or the generation immediately following their lives. This is viewed as relatively early compared with other ancient texts, something which took hold in the early Christian community early on, and left little room for falsehood or legendary details to form. Following this period, we see the growing Christian community already knowing and using these core texts, although they are as of yet unofficially formed as a single collection. There are two figures that very early on reference the Gospels as being seen as sacred and authoritative. The first is Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius is known to have written several letters while on his way to martyrdom in Rome. From the letter to the Philadelphians, Ignatius says, "I take refuge in the gospel, as in the flesh of Jesus, and in the apostles, as the presbytery of the church." And from his letter to the Smyrnaeans, I do not command you like Peter and Paul. They were apostles. I am a convict. These were both written around 107 AD. The second figure is Justin Martyr, an early Christian apologist who referenced scripture in his work defining and defending the Christian faith. From his first apology, on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as time permits. And for the apostles, in the memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels, have delivered unto us what was commanded them. And from his work, Dialogue with Trypho, for in the memoirs, which I say were drawn up by his apostles and those who followed him. These are from around 150 AD. They are another fascinating early evidence that the Gospels were widely in circulation in the early Christian communities, seen as coming from the apostles and their followers, and viewed as authoritative because of this fact. We also have a quote from a third figure, Irenaeus, which came shortly after around 180 AD, who in his work against heresies states, "It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer than four." This shows that early Christian tradition quickly identified and solidified what they saw as the Gospels. The emerging of these works in the church wasn't immediately met with a desire to firmly clarify what was Scripture and what wasn't. As often happens in church history, it took a heresy to force the church to authoritatively define something often held traditionally. However, as we will see, this authoritative definition for the biblical canon takes more than 1,000 years and develops in stages. The first stage begins with a man called Marcion. Marcion was a teacher with an extreme view of Scripture. He entirely rejected the Old Testament and only embraced part of the New Testament, containing simply part of Luke and 10 of Paul's letters. It is a radically shortened version of what we now know as the Bible, but it was important because it was the first officially defined biblical canon, even though it greatly missed the mark. This forced the church to really begin to look at what it viewed as inspired scripture and what it didn't. While this and other controversies forced discussion, we find ourselves at the period of history where we find one of the first surviving lists of the biblical canon, the Muratorian fragment. The fragment, from around 170 AD, shows that among the recognized books were the four Gospels, Acts, most of the Pauline letters, and Revelation. It notably does not include all 27 books recognized today, showing that the canon was not yet complete. However, it was mostly recognized at the time. Surprisingly, it took another 200 years before our first surviving list of the actual and modern canon comes about. This list comes from Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, where in his festal letter of 367, he compiles a list of 27 books in the New Testament canon, which we see today. This canon list was later confirmed by regional church councils at Hippo and Carthage within the next few decades. It is important to note, as we have seen, the councils did not come together and invent a biblical canon. They recognized the books already in use by the universal church at the time. Following this, the canon of Scripture existed relatively peacefully for more than 1,000 years, before another major crisis in church history forced the church to authoritatively define the canon once and for all. This crisis was the Reformation brought about by Martin Luther. As part of his reforms, Luther removed several books from the Bible which he rejected. This prompted the church to issue a decree which closed the topic for good. At the Council of Trent in 1546, the biblical canon was firmly and authoritatively defined, remarking that, if anyone does not accept as sacred and canonical the aforesaid books in their entirety with all their parts, as they have been accustomed to be read in the Catholic Church, and are contained in the Old Latin Vulgate edition, and knowingly and deliberately rejects the aforesaid traditions, let him be anathema. So what do we learn from all this? We learn that the early Christian community existed for nearly 300 years, if not longer, without a firmly defined biblical canon, something that throws a shadow of doubt on many people's desire to live sola scriptura. considering the church founded by Christ existed prior to what we know as the Bible. It took the church to define what Scripture was through the tradition of the early church and exclude from it books unworthy of the title. Without the formal guidance of the church magisterium, it is well possible that the Bible as we know it wouldn't exist today. There are many books which might have been included, such as 1 Enoch, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Gospel of Thomas, etc., and many which might have been excluded. We will take a look at these books in another video. Through the surviving early church fathers' sources and early church councils, we have a glimpse at the development of the biblical canon as we know it today. We did not receive the Bible as one book overnight. It appeared gradually through the life of the early church. Understanding this key fact helps us read and understand Scripture and helps us better understand our Christian faith.